Everyone ready? We negate, resolve, prioritizing economic development over environmental protections in the best interest of the people of India. We begin by observing these Gopher Christian toxic watch lines, right? India currently puts the economy above the environment in the status quo. This means that the world of the informative is the status quo. This is a preferable way to look at the resolution because it gives the ground a clear set of policies to examine. Contention 1, unsustainable energy use. To fuel its current level of economic growth, the economist projects that India must boost its power generation capacity at least sixfold by 2030. Moreover, according to India's Central Statistics Office, only 3% of India's power comes from renewable energy. Problematically, according to Devinder Kumar of the Center for Defense and Strategic Studies, India's domestic reserves of natural gas, oil, and coal will all run out within 40 years. Even more of a problem is that India's reliance on fossil fuels leads to climate change, a problem India is particularly vulnerable to. William Klein of the Peterson Foundation calculates a 2.5% increase in global temperatures leads to a 40% decrease in agricultural output. Another problem is that fossil fuel reliance leads to air pollution. According to the World Health Organization, outdoor air pollution causes 620,000 premature deaths per year in India. But environmental protection can solve this problem. Susan Lagwitz of the Natural Resource Defense Council says India can act as a potential dealmaker that can work with other nations to foster agreement on climate change. Most importantly, Rajat Gupta of the McKinsey Institute finds, without compromising its prospects for growth, we believe India has the technical potential to shrink its projected energy consumption by 22% and lower its consequent greenhouse gas emissions by an additional 30 to 50%. Contention 2, agrarian destruction. Ratna Reddy, the Center for Economics and Social Studies, finds in India, overuse of agricultural land, polluted water and chemicals, and rampant development leads to major degradation. He writes, almost 2/3 of the land is degraded in one form or another. More importantly, he continues, the extent of degradation is not only increasing over time, but also growing at an increasing rate, is likely to aggravate along with development activities. He continues, the degradation is reaching irreversible levels. As an effective measure adopted to arrest the degradation, achieving sustainable development would remain a distant dream. That's problematic because land degradation destroys India's agriculture. V.K. Ashish of the Indian Agricultural Research Institute finds degradation's losses vary between 10 to 27% of the value of agricultural output due to the nature and severity of the degradation of land. That is important because rising food prices harm the living conditions of India's poor. Alok Sharma of the Institute for Human Development finds the link between agricultural growth and rural poverty can be gauged from the fact that 76% of the population lives in rural areas. Depriving them of their income makes the dream of a modern India impossible. Contention 3, water shortages. Gretchen Anderson of NASA explains in India, groundwater is being pumped and consumed by human activities faster than the aquifers could be replenished by natural processes. Juan Valero projects in the European Financial Review, by 2030, demand for water in India is expected to climb to more than twice the country's current water supply. The World Bank finds, if current trends continue, in 20 years about 60% of all of India's aquifers will be in critical condition. The impacts will be devastating. Matt Rudel of NASA explains, if measures are not taken to ensure sustainable groundwater use, consequences for 114 million people include a collapse of agricultural output and severe shortages of potable water. As Tushar Shah of the International Water Management Institute puts it, when the balloon bursts, untold anarchy will be the lot of rural India. In fact, water is the biggest and most widespread problem India faces. Nahir Shah of India's Natural Resource Planning Commission writes, India's economic growth and political stability are at stake in coming years. It does not change its approach to water management. If this is not attended to, India's growth story will completely go off the rails. He wants a potential catastrophic conflict over water since it's a threat to the democratic fabric itself. Fortunately, this problem is easily solvable by prioritizing the environment. Valero finds agricultural technology can be the biggest part of the solution. Minor irrigation systems can reduce the amount of water loss by 30 to 70% depending on crop and weather conditions. The Economic Times also proposes wastewater recycling and desalination to solve the problem. And Gupta says efficient pump use as well as rainwater collection can reduce water loss by 25%. Because the current trajectory of India is one headed for ruin. To correct that course, we negate.
So while we're looking at water, can I see a couple of things? First, in your first contention, I get the that you can shrink emissions a lot without the growth trajectory. In your second contention, how the land is permanently degraded, and then the third contention, you have to meet everything.
Can you read them again? The first one I heard.
First contention was you shrink emissions without harming growth trajectory.
Yeah. And the second one?
Second is the land that's degraded is permanently not usable. And on your first contention,
That's right.
there's too much.
Yeah, that one makes sense.
And I don't need it right now. Just
Yeah, but I don't think we want to walk behind you, do you?
Oh, no, just like after I get finished.
You have four.
We can amplify conditions that that's it. I mean, I think that will be a full article. That is the full article. So, yeah. What was the third one you wanted? Valero. Valero. Yeah.
You guys deliver everything?
We delivered two games. Sorry.
Valero solvency or Valero excellence?
Yeah, and I want like full of okay, and I'll let we're good to get it.
We can't get full proof until
Yeah, after the case. Okay. Is everyone there?
Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah, good to go. Because economic development makes India a better place for everyone, we affirm. Contention 1, economic development is a prerequisite to environmental protection. Development must come first for two reasons. First, it eliminates the root cause of environmental degradation in India, poverty. As the International Fund for Development explains, the poor that represent 2/3 of the population have little choice but to overuse the limited resources available to them, resulting in environmental degradation. Fortunately, economic growth can end the cycle of poverty and environmental destruction, as the World Bank reports that rising incomes alleviate environmental stress. Second, growth allows for investments that protect the environment. Eric Newmeyer of the London School of Economics puts it simply: increased economic growth will generate environmental benefits through the development and adoption of new, more efficient technology. For that exact reason, Walt in the Journal of Economics empirically demonstrates that in the long term, a 1% increase in Indian per capita GDP reduces carbon emissions by 0.5%. Conjecture 2, economic development meets the people's needs. Subpoint A, transportation infrastructure. Bloomberg Business reports India has underinvested in infrastructure for 60 years, so the country's systems are literally crumbling under the weight of progress. To solve this infrastructure crisis, Deepa Harai of the Indian Services Group finds that India must invest 10% of its GDP in infrastructure, a development program with three main benefits. First, facilitating the flow of goods and services and eliminating congestion and market isolation. This investment yields massive returns. Professor Seaman Adler of the University of Zurich demonstrates that the gains of infrastructure investments are more than 3 times the costs. This benefits the entire Indian population. A study from the McKinsey Global Institute found that investing 10% of GDP would create 34 million jobs. Second, the World Bank finds that rural road building projects provide economic opportunity for Indians isolated from the national economy, increasing average rural household incomes by 50 to 100% in India. Third, reducing motor deaths in India. Sanjay Singh of the Institute for Mention argues the main reason the road safety situation is so bad that 126,000 Indians die annually in motor accidents is inadequate transportation infrastructure. Indeed, developing India's infrastructure could diminish the 100% increase in road traffic deaths that will otherwise occur by 2025. Subpoint B, lighting up India. Currently, the World Bank reports that 400 million Indians lack electricity, while the nation as a whole has a severe power shortage. Luckily, economic development can help generate and distribute power for the people of India in 2 ways. First, developing space-based solar power can meet India's energy needs. The U.S. Department of Energy completed the process. Solar panels in orbit beam energy to receiving stations connected to the electricity grid on the ground. University of Ohio professor Rangappan Gopaswamy explains the benefit. Space-based solar power would quadruple India's supply of energy and almost double India's per capita GDP, delivering a net GDP benefit to the nation estimated to be worth over $100 trillion. Second, building electrification infrastructure could energize people currently in the dark. Statistically, the World Bank reveals that electricity allows Indians to use cheaper power and efficient time-saving technologies, enabling improvements in productivity that increase per capita income by 38% and reduce poverty by 13.3%. Subpoint C, health. Jason Gill of Bloomberg reveals the crisis. 75% of India's water is infected with human feces or industrial pollution. However, economic development in the form of waste control and plumbing infrastructure can provide Indians with clean water. Gunther Fink of the Harvard School of Public Health estimates that providing for appropriate sanitation and water infrastructure would reduce childhood mortality by 45%. Given that the Wall Street Journal finds that 1.7 million children die annually in India, development would save over 765,000 lives. Subpoint D, free trade. Currently, Max Baucus of the Committee on Finance explains that trade policies in India are becoming increasingly protectionist. Unfortunately, the World Bank reports that such policies hurt the people by restricting the flow of commerce into India. Fortunately, by liberating the Indian economy, development can provide 2 main benefits. First, increased economic growth. If India lowered tariffs that discourage trade and removed stifling regulations, the World Bank finds that Indian GDP would see a 15% rise by 2020. Indeed, Devisha Mishra of Syracuse University empirically finds that a 10% reduction in tariff rates would reduce poverty by 7.5% by creating economic opportunity for all. Second, free trade stabilizes the Indian-Pakistani conflict. As Mansoom Murshid of the University of Birmingham demonstrates, opening up trade incentivizes peace through trust building and discourages conflict. Statistically, Edward Mansfield of the University of Pennsylvania finds that a trade agreement would reduce the probability of war by 50%, saving millions from a potentially catastrophic conflict. Vote for peace, vote for life, vote Crow.
You see the $1 trillion card and the card? solid Lutra and these and Lutra. Yeah, can I you ask my rebuttal? Is that your rebuttal?
And then can I hang on third with the hundred?
Yeah. Where's the other one? The other one. Are we allowed to pack during the way?
You have the curves, right? Yeah. Yeah, we're just trying to. Yeah. Can you show them the question?
Any they didn't use grapple, we are providing the card.
Yeah, no, providing the cards is one thing, but once they have the card. These are our cards.
They're giving it to us.
Okay, perfect. They're still looking for your cards. Gotcha. There are a couple of different philosophies that the article has.
Thank you. And the answer? Expected.
Sorry for the delay.
That was close. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Judge Trey.
How long did you get it?
How long has it been developing? I mean, probably since it started being a nation.
How long is their environment improved?
How long has their environment been improving? It hasn't really improved.
So when
But-
the first intention says that development increases, that environment improves.
Right.
India's been developing
In-
while the
in-
environment's been degrading.
In the long term, India's really only been developing for about, since it was founded in like the 60s, that's about 50 years, that's not that long for the.
How long is the
nation.
long term?
Okay, we can show you the consonant curve, but essentially what it's saying is that in the long term, the overall decrease is a decrease.
So
in
when
emissions.
does, okay, the cousin curve is a curve, right? That means it's going over a curve and hitting point. Where is that?
I don't know, you tell me.
Yeah, I think Sam's gonna come up here and try to, it's like, normally it's a linear impact. Like it's linear, like as development increases, so as the environment degrades. Unless you prioritize the environment, where it becomes a curve. The more you prioritize the environment, the earlier the curve becomes.
That's not how the consonant curve works.
How
It's
the
about the
consonant-
scale of prioritizing economic
Okay,
development.
do you want to
Let me
ask me a
you a
question? Yeah.
When a policy benefits both the economy and the environment, how do you determine what the priority is?
I would argue that's indication.
Why is that indication?
Two reasons. One, you could say that you're prioritizing 90% either, which makes it a nation. Or B, it's a shift from the status quo towards the environment. The status quo, they prioritize the environment. Either way.
Okay, so responding to the first point, the definition of prioritize from Merriam-Webster is mark as more important. Even when you're doing two things at once, you can still mark one of them as more important, which is why we propose that you should use the primary effects test to see what the priority is in these policies. That's what I'm about to get to.
Awesome.
We need to look at what the necessary and immediate effect of a policy is to see if it's
Let's
economic
discuss
development
necessary
or
and immediate.
effect.
How immediate are space-based solar panels going to get?
15 to 20 years, but you say we're going to run out of fossil
How
fuels. Hold on.
expensive
You say we're going to run out of fossil fuels in 40 years. That's
Okay, one of the
2054.
shortages-
That's
wait,
2054.
okay, let's discuss
All of my
space-
impacts
space
materialize
solar
by
panels.
2052.
Okay.
So it's before all of the energy shortages that
2052,
you're talking
2054.
about.
Okay, one, how expensive are space-based solar panels?
They don't cost $100 trillion. I can
How
tell you that much.
expensive? Okay, does India have the
It
technical
says
potential?
$3 trillion
Okay, how
over
many
15 to 20
rockets
years.
have India launched?
I don't know.
Like, they haven't
I
launched
mean,
really.
I can give you, the study says it's feasible. It outlines how much it would
It says
cost.
if they can launch, even the US,
In
like,
15 to
is
20
not
years,
even
it's not
investing.
an immediate.
How much is it gonna cost?
$3 trillion. That's what the study says.
How much is India's budget right now?
I mean, it's not about their annual budget, given that it's
They
over
would literally
15
get,
to 20 years.
even
which I've
if you
said that
divide
all the
3
time.
trillion by 15 to 20 years, that would literally like be their entire budget.
I mean, you seem to think it's worth it, given that your entire first contention is about ways to
I
find
would argue
sustainable
it's
energy.
it would be impossible because if you take away their entire
Okay,
budget,
so let me
like,
ask you a
nothing else
question.
left. And, well,
How do you propose India gets sustainable energy?
renewable energy?
Like how?
Terrestrial
Like what?
solar panels, not space solar
Okay,
panels.
why is that? How much that's gonna cost?
A lot cheaper than launching them into outer space. Gupta says they can do it right now without compromising costs.
And they can provide all their power?
Yeah, 70% is the card
So, question about your Kumar study.
Actually,
Why does it say they run
let's
out
save
of
that question
resources?
for later. Crossfire. We'll take some prep time, please. Thank you. That was 41 seconds I got.
How much time do you guys have left?
Start with the first intention, which is about how economic growth is a prerequisite to environmental protection. There's a lot of problems intended. First, if the point of economic growth is still to promote environmental protection, that's still negative ground because the goal is still environmental protection. Second, really importantly, remember the question my brother asked you him in Crossfire, which is that India, how long has India been growing? They've been growing since their creation, which is in the 1940s. At that point, they haven't seen any environmental protection during that period of growth, which clearly shows that economic growth isn't correlated with any reduction in environmental harm. But then, of course, Will responded to that when he said that the environmental Kuznets curve. But the problem is, remember that it's a curve. The peak of the curve, according to Christoph Heidel, the University of Heidelberg, who basically the peak of the curve is when these countries start taking environmental policies. At that point, if you want to see that curve happening, you need to prioritize environmental protection. So that's going to be the turn of the case. But then fourth, they tell you now, but then of course, the internal link to this contention is that they're reducing poverty. Problematic for my opponents, that's not actually true at all. Because development doesn't increase to reduce poverty. Here you're going to turn to Colin Todhunter of the Center on Research and Globalization, who basically explains that ever since India started growing rapidly in the 1990s, there hasn't been any decline in the poverty alleviation rate. Thus, since economic growth isn't correlated with any reduction in poverty, they lose the internal link. But also turning the argument against them is also going to turn their last thing on their the second contention, which is that the way India is actually developing is actually harming poverty. According to Chancellor Sharma of Kurukshetra University, that basically, unlike the cherry-picked examples of development they talk about, the way India actually prioritizes economic development is mainly by liberalization. Problematic for my opponent, Yosef Patnaik of Nehru University, explains that Liberalization leads to all this cropland being converted from food crops to export crops. As a result, the average Indian family consumes 100 kilograms less food than just 5 years ago, and as a result, Patnaik concludes that a real and accurate poverty rate would show that poverty has increased considerably during 15 years of reform. Thus, you're just going to be turning their entire internal bank against them. But now go on to the second sentence about meeting needs. On step point A about transportation, 2 turns in this. First, we turn to the Indian Institute of Technology, which states the way India prioritizes transportation infrastructure is without any regard to the environment, which leads to all 30 of the 33 million people being displaced from these projects and putting them in dehumanizing camps. That's a turn, but even more important term comes from the economic development phase, who finds that because of all the environmental harms of building these transportation infrastructure, it leads to a 4 to 8% decrease in GDP. You're going to be turning the entire argument against them because the transportation infrastructure harms their own advocacy. Now going to step point B about lighting up India. Now first off, keep in mind the analysis we give you from Kumar says that they're going to run out in 40 years. You need to have alternative energy first to protect these natural resources, otherwise it's insolvable. Then you can use space-based solar panels. Couple problems. One is ridiculously expensive. You say it's not $10 trillion. $9 trillion is still way beyond India's capacity. They aren't giving you any solvency. Second, they're not, remember Will asked them how many rockets have they gotten off there. They're not showing you that they've any of the capacity to actually develop this. They aren't giving you the warmth for this. But third, this is really important. Space-based solar panels are exactly that. Solar panels. Solar panels are designed for environmental protection because you're designed to protect against using fossil fuels. At that point, because it's environmental protection, all the benefits of space-based solar panels are actually going to be flowing to our side. Then they go on to the subpoint B about health. Now, a couple problems with this. First, you're going to outweigh this argument. Keep in mind that even if they promote health infrastructure, the fact that 600 is more efficient to stop people from getting sick in the first place than to treat them after they're being sick. That's why the 620,000 lives we provide you with the air pollution is going to outweigh. But second, they tell you that the big problem with health comes from water pollution. Keep in mind that cleaning up water pollution is stopping pollution. That's clearly going to be negative grounds. If you buy their argument about water pollution, you're voting for us. Then they give you all these policies. We have free trade. I already responded to the Patnaik evidence. But then they give you this impact from the Indo-Pak War. The first problem is that according to CNN, an Indo-Pak War, no matter how much they increase trade, is entirely unlikely to begin with. So reducing it from 0.001% to 0.0001% is not really a big impact you're going to weigh into today's round. But actually, you're going to be turning the argument against it. But according to the UN, the severe stress on water resources is going to increase the likelihood of a war with India, Pakistan, and actually China and Bangladesh as well. That's if you're going to be looking to the Indo-Pak War or even an entire regional war, you're going to be looking at this balance.
We'll run a little. Is everybody ready?
Give me 1 second. Yep, okay.
My opponent's case is economic development by a different name. Start at the top. Their first observation says right now India is prioritizing economic development, so we have to defend the status quo. My first response is that this is just not true. The New York Times tells us that in the status quo, India is weighing competing environmental and economic concerns, which means they haven't chosen. We don't have to defend the failed path of development in the past. We can look forward to see how development can succeed in the future. But my second response is that development is going to change over time. Just because we did liberalization for the past 20 years doesn't mean we're going to do further liberalization in the future. It means that we're going to pursue things like infrastructure projects, which is why in our transportation infrastructure point, those investments are actually already earmarked. My third response is that if my opponents are holding us to that standard, that means they have to do the same, which means that they have to defend the failed environmental policies that Michael Greenstone of MIT tells us haven't resulted in any sort of environmental protection efforts over the last 20 years. With that in mind, I have 2 overviews to their case. The first overview is that money is about more than just money. Remember that economic development is actually going to save lives because a study conducted by Princeton University finds that a 20% increase in per capita GDP means that people can access health services and other things like that, which saves 81,000 lives every single year in India. My second overview is that we have to define actually what economic development means. Dr. Lloyd Dumas of the University of Texas tells us that economic development is a process that raises the material standard of living for the vast majority of the population. What that means is that we're talking about material improvements to the quality of life on the affirmative advocacy, and my opponents have to defend other things like that. In their first contention, they talk about energy energy use. Now, my first response that this is actually a reason to affirm. If you look at their Kumar analysis, it specifically said the reason that India is running out is because economic development isn't developed enough. They said that we actually need to improve technology and things to improve India's ability to extract resources from the environment, like natural gas and the like. My second response is that when they talk about renewable energy as the way to solve, this is economic development for 3 reasons. First, if we look at intent, Gauri Singh, India's Minister for New and Renewable Energy, says that when they're developing renewable energy, our priority is to achieve energy security and self-reliance. Climate change is not the main driver for renewable energy in India. What that means is that when they advocate for renewable energy, that is our ground, which leads to the second reason that it's economic development, which is because its primary effect is to produce energy to drive the Indian economy. But the third reason is that even if the sources are environmental protection like solar panels, a prerequisite to achieving those benefits is to develop the electricity infrastructure, which my opponents just dropped in his rebuttal. Now let's look at their specific things. They first talk about climate change. My first response is that the Council on Foreign Relations tells us that India can't do anything on its own, because they're only responsible for 4% of emissions, and there's no international consensus on climate change. But the second thing is that climate change is going to happen regardless, so that means that India has to adapt. The United Nations tells us that the only way that India is actually going to be able to deal with the effects of climate change is if they pursue adaptation through economic development. My opponent's second impact here is air pollution. Now first you can turn this against them, because economic development is actually going to reduce air pollution for a couple of reasons. Professor Matthew Holman of San Jose State University empirically finds that in India, when you improve the standard of living, people stop burning wood and biomass and things like that, which is the main driver of air pollution, and turn to electricity, which is ultimately cleaner. But the second reason that the Asian Development Bank finds that when you improve transportation infrastructure, you actually lead to more efficient transit, which reduces air pollution by 20%. Those are both turns. Let's look at my opponent's second contention where they talk about agrarian things. Now my first response is that you can turn this against them because economic development is going to make this a non-issue. They say there are already a lot of problematic farmland in India, but Eric Nomeyer of the London School of Economics finds that with economic development, you see a shift away from an agrarian economy and toward the service sector-based economy, so it doesn't matter. Now second, they provide absolutely no solvency for any of this, so even if it's a problem they don't solve in the negative world. My third response is that the reason that this happens is because of over-farming. Farmers don't lie fields fallow because they are so pressed for they're so pressed to produce food that they're overplanting and things like that. However, when you build transportation infrastructure that increases farmers' incomes, that means that they don't have to do that and you solve the problem. Let's look at their third contention where they talk about water shortages. My first response is that they tell you the problem is too much pumping. The problem is too much pumping because farmers need to grow a ton of food because it takes a lot of money to get that food to market because transportation infrastructure is really bad. So when you improve transportation infrastructure, reduce those costs, you reduce the overpumping problem. But second, their solvency mechanisms are all economic development. Irrigation, building like wastewater and treatment and things like that, those all require infrastructure. Those all require material improvements in the standard of living. That's all economic development. My opponent's case is a reason to vote in affirmation, and that's why you're going to vote pro.
India is not currently prioritizing economic development because they're like, yeah, New York Times, they're weighing votes, right? Yeah. So if they're weighing votes, but they're doing one more emphasis than the other, is that going to be?
I wouldn't argue that they're doing one with more emphasis than the other, because if you actually look at the history of Indian environmental policy, it starts back in the 70s. They have actually pretty substantial reverence for the environment, and they've been actually trying to protect it for a while. That's why you see a lot of socialist policies implemented in the late 70s and 80s, where they're trying to reduce the
policies trying to promote economic development. But the question that gets back to the
they're trying to ensure that people don't overuse resources, which is why you actually have to do economic development to prevent that from happening. Go ahead.
So if you're taking these economic development policies and it promotes the environment, is that environmental protection or economic protection?
Well, there are two things to this. The first thing we have to consider is that since there's no actor in the resolution, intent is going to be sort of hard to determine. It's not going to be able to be determined.
Right, so we don't have to determine intent,
second, hold on.
The end result, right?
Well, the end result can be a lot of things, right? So, for example, the Indian Minister of Renewable Energy specifically tells us that they're pursuing green growth in order to, hold on, let me finish.
Yeah.
They're pursuing green growth specifically not to combat climate change, but instead to improve energy security. No, I'm not saying that you can't determine intent. I'm saying it's hard.
No,
you can't do it in every circumstance. That's not like a blanket.
I want to take back to the exact question. Which is that, for instance, if they were to develop infrastructure that would promote the environment, and you say infrastructure is economic development, is that environmental protection or economic development?
I'd say it's economic development because the primary and necessary effect of the policy is to promote the economy.
Okay,
because,
so
I don't know what the effects of a lot of my policies are going to be in the super long term, but if we look at the primary and necessary effect, that's most closely related to the action, and so that's the best way to determine it.
So let's take the example of a recycling plant. Like a recycling plant is definitely infrastructure, but how is that not environmental protection?
Well, I wouldn't say that like a recycling plant. Well, I don't know. So really, let's
Right,
use the
so
primary
that-
effects test. So what's the primary necessary effect? You're taking old things and turning it
Right,
into
so as
new
long
things.
as
I would
the
say that's
infrastructure
economy.
project
So that's
promotes the
probably
environment,
economic
it's still
development.
environmental protection.
No, because for example, look, if you're saying intent is the way that we weigh things,
No, I didn't.
we know here's an example. No, I think you said the goal.
Yeah,
The
the end goal.
of it.
Yeah, right.
So
The end result.
right, the end result, the end goal, the end intent. So if the Indian Energy Manager tells us that, for example, renewable energy is economic development, even if in the long term it
Here's the
achieves
problem
environmental,
with
let me
it.
finish,
Yeah.
because this is really important. Even if in the end it might happen to achieve some environmental benefits, that doesn't necessarily mean that
Here's
it's
the
environmental
problem
protection.
with your entire analysis of alternative energy. There is no reason why India would develop alternative energy as opposed to conventional energy unless they were concerned about the environment.
Well, no,
We definitely
you give the
prove
reason.
intent here.
You give the reason. India doesn't have that many domestic sources of fossil fuels. You say they're going to run out, so how do they fix the problem? Well, if we want energy security, we should probably use the sun that's above us. That's not a renewable energy goal for the environment. That's a renewable energy goal in order to develop the economy. And that's what our evidence says.
Thank you. 45 seconds I got? First, respond to the Dumor analysis that says economic development inherently needs a material needs. That's not inherent. They can prove that. Like, they can't get this define an equal increase in quality of life economic development. Then the first on power, their only offensive response to that economic development. Remember, the only reason they're shifting renewable energy is because they're running out of natural resources. They wouldn't shift unless they're feared natural resources. Protection against natural resource depletion is negative ground. They get no offense. Okay, first voter issue that's offense for us is going to be a barren destruction. They get new out of this if they're shifting away from agriculture. But even if the more people are moving to the city, doesn't mean they still don't need food. Our impact still exists. Then they say there's no solvency. Solvency is the same as the one in water technology, which is Valero, which says that you can have improved agricultural techniques. Then they say they're over farming, but the fact is the reason they're over farming is because economic development has pushed them to do so. That's a turn on their own turn. 4 ways you weigh this. 1, on magnitude, everyone needs food. You run out of food, you lose life. 2, on scope, everyone needs it. That outweighs on scope. 3, it's irreversible. All the impacts will be reversed. This one can't once to destroy. That's the ready analysis. 4th is a prerequisite. You need food in order for all those policies to exist. That's a prerequisite to arguments. Second voter issue is going to be on water. They say that the reason there's too much planning. The reason why there's too much planning is because economic development has forced them to do so because of liberalization. That's the warrant. Then they say that it's economic development. Remember, if the purpose of the infrastructure is to promote the environment, conserve natural resources, that's negative ground. Don't let them veer out and define away all our grounds. 4 ways you weigh this. First extent of rodals is the demand is going to outstrip supply by 2-fold. 4 ways you weigh. 1, on magnitude, again, this affects everyone untold anarchy because you have no water. 2nd, on scope, everyone needs water. This outweighs on scope. 3rd, it's a prerequisite. None of their impacts occur if you don't have water. 4th, it's irreversible. Remember, if you can't, once the water's gone, it's gone. Their impacts can be solved there. This is irreversible. That outweighs. Now it turns on their case. First, on the prerequisite argument, remember they've been developing 20 years, it never has happened. But second, remember, you only see it turning to occur if you prioritize the environment. Then extend Todd Hunter says poverty is not decreased only, and the pot 9 says actually poverty is increased and quality of life is declined from them. Then on infrastructure, remember, Indian Institute of Technology says dehumanizing by displacing you, and third, the term that says actually decreases GDP from the Economic Development Bank. Finally, remember, the space-based leadership is infeasible, and actually risk of war, Pakistan, and regional war actually goes up unless you prioritize environmental protection. Thus, we urge a negative ballot.
Alright, we're going top.
Is everyone ready? Justin and I are winning this round for a few main reasons. First of all, look at how you determine what the priority is in terms of economic development or environmental protection. They tell you at the top of the case that you need to look at the goal of the policies. That's intent. We tell you you should look at the primary effect. No matter what, you need to be looking at one of those two policies because prioritizing means market is more important, and even if a policy does both, only one of the things can be more important. With that in mind, we're winning because we show you the benefits of economic development. First, we show you as a prerequisite. My opponents try to tell you that there hasn't been economic environmental protection since the 40s. That's because they haven't developed enough. GDP isn't as good. They've been trying to balance the two policies. They just aren't able to because they haven't developed enough. Second of all, they say that you need to have them start doing environmental protection policies because that's when the peak hits. On the cuts in this curve, you don't force the peak. The peak is supposed to naturally happen. They're not letting it naturally happen. We're saying we should. So in the long term, you can decrease in emissions and environmental degradation. That's the first benefit, turn in the entire case. Second of all, when you look at the benefits for transportation, my opponents try to say that there's this harm of this of displacing people. However, a new law passed in February of this year by the Indian Parliament says transportation projects literally cannot displace people anymore. There's not going to be a harm. The GDP statistic that they give you, they have no link there, so you can just clean extend our impacts of the 34 million jobs, the 50 to 100% increase in per capita GDP, and everything else that we talked about in that contention. Second, when you look at lighting up energy, compare the both renewable energy points here, here's what you have to do. You need to see if they're environmental protection or economic development. First, look to intent. The intent from the Prime Minister of India of renewable energy is to benefit the economy. That's economic development. If you look at the primary effect, it's to provide energy. That's part of economic development as well. No matter what, their entire first contention, which they say has the biggest impacts in today's round, is going to be economic development, is going to be turned to our side. Finally, go to our subpoint C about health infrastructure. They try to say that, we're stopping pollution, so this is really for them. We're not cleaning up lakes and rivers. We're cleaning water once it's in pipes outside of the environmental media. That's just economic development. All those lives impacts are just on our side. Finally, when you go to their case, I already showed you why unsustainable energy is our ground. When you go to agricultural, they don't give you solvency, nor do they respond to the idea. They try to say economic development is the reason why they're over farming. Their link is liberalization, which they don't explain. It's same on water. We tell you it's over farming. They try to go back to liberalization. Again, they don't explain it. Their solvency on that is economic development as well. For all those reasons, we are to probe out.
Yeah, I got that.
So in this natural cousin curve, where does it naturally be?
So the idea is if you just watch a country develop, at a certain point on the development curve, it's different for every country, but at a certain point on the development curve,
Where is it?
they'll start protecting the targets naturally.
The logic is really important.
Yeah,
So, let's look at the logic. The logic is that when you're living in poverty, when your children don't have enough food in place to eat, when you don't have any money to buy anything, you're not going to care about whether or not chopping down the forest is going to have long-term implications. You're going to chop down that forest and burn that biomass. That's why when you improve economic development, then you reduce the incentive to overuse natural resources, and that's when you actually improve and achieve the benefits of agrarian, like preventing agrarian violence.
You are so close to the empirical evidence what it says, you get a slight part wrong. It is true that when people want more money, but the thing is, what the empirical evidence we read in rebuttal specifically says is when at a certain point people want environmental protection. It's still, that's what they said. At that point, it's still environmental protection is the reason why it peaks.
It's not about desire though. It's about the ability to not overuse something. So if I'm a farmer in India, right?
It's about resource
That they have the capacity now. There's no reason to wait for it to naturally. They have the money to do it right now. That's hilarious.
If you could show that two-thirds of the Indian population that make $2 a day,
Well,
they don't have the resources.
they don't have to buy it personally. The Indian government could subsidize it. That's a way that they can get away
No,
with
they
that
can't
money.
subsidize them.
You're the one saying
They
you should
use
subsidize
external
space-based
resources.
lasers.
But can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
All right. So in terms of figuring out what the priority is, economic development or environmental protection, we have proposed both intent and primary effects. Do you want to use one of those? Do you have another idea? How do you want to figure out what the priority is?
Is important, yes. I would argue weighing is always important. We
Yeah.
should take,
No,
when
I'm
you
saying,
take,
how
when
do
you
you
take a
figure it out?
specific, here's the way, it's really simple, it actually combines both, right, so it's a compromise. when you look at a specific policy, you look at the holistic benefits or harms to that policy. As a result, that's what you're determining whether or not it's environmental protection or economic development.
So what if it benefits both the environment and the economy? That's what I'm talking about.
Whichever one benefits more.
What if the benefits are simultaneous? Like, how do you weigh cleaning up a river?
I would argue that's
10%
absolutely environmental protection. How is pollution not protecting the environment? You're literally someone spoiling the river, whether it's the pipe or a river, you're still protecting against environmental harm.
I'm saying some policies can do both. Some policies can protect the environment and develop the economy simultaneously. But we're the only ones giving you a definition of prioritize as mark is more important, and in that individual policy, only one thing can be more important.
If cleaning up pollution is environmental protection, and cleaning up pollution is the first internal link, then that's going to be the more important
So
part.
that's a primary effects test. That's a different thing.
But look, with the health infrastructure, you're not cleaning up an environmental media. You're taking the water out of the environment, putting it in a sewage system, and then having it go
cleaning out the pollutants, which is a form of environmental damage.
But it's not making lakes and rivers any cleaner. It's cleaning
still
water.
cleaning up the natural resource that is the river
But it's
water.
not part of the environmental media.
It still will be part of the environment because it's still a natural resource.
Okay, so does that mean that, like,
We have 20 seconds to pass, 25?
Sorry, I got 35.
I'll take 35. Brother ready? Brother ready? And all my judge chair. And we'll just go right down the voting issue. Okay? One of the biggest voting issues you're going to look into today, John, is going to be architecture and contention, which comes from agrarian destruction. They respond to this in saying the reason why they're overusing the land is because they're impoverished. But remember, we'll beat that back and explain that the reason why they're overplanting is because of environment, because of economic development. That's the not evidence that's never responded to, that basically says when they do all this liberalization, that incentivizes them to develop cash crops instead of food crops, and as a result, they're seeing less food, 100 kilograms, I think, than just 5 years ago. At that point, here's how we also give you the solvency to this better agricultural technology. We give you a plethora of those reasons, all those are to be extended. And here's how we weigh the issue. We're actually the only ones giving you these weighing analysis. 4 ways. Magnitude. First, starvation is a huge impact to death. Scope, everyone needs food, so clearly it's not weighing on scope. Irreversible, remember the ready evidence is never respond to and extended in all our speeches. It says it's reaching an irreversible level. At that point, that's irreversible. None of their impacts are irreversible. Unless you have prerequisite, remember you need food in order to develop any of the economy. That's going to outweigh in prerequisite as well, and outweigh their arguments. Now go to the second voting issue, is really important, it comes from water. Remember, they again give the overplanting response, and will again beat that back when you think the reason why they're overplanting and using too much water is because they have less land, because they're being taken away because of liberalization and because of economic development. That's going to clean flow throughout, and we also give you the solvency from better agricultural technology. Let's here's how you weighing it. Magnitude and scope is irreversibility and prerequisite again. So you need water, it affects every single person, and we see it's irreversible. Once you take water out, it's not coming back. It's the only irreversible impact that stays on our side of the case. Now go to the terms that they drop in their case. They can't beat this back and bond brokers, don't let them. First, from Hunter, who says the growth isn't correlated to any reduction in poverty. Second, from Patnaik, who says that liberalization incentivizes people to stop developing food crops, which leads to mass starvation and increased poverty. And then from the European Development Bank, they say there's no link, but we give you a link that because the infrastructure leads to all this environmental destruction, that's where the 4 to 8% of GDP gets destroyed. They never beat this back. Then on the Indian-Pakistan war, we give you the warrant that says that when there's conflict over water resources, that increases the risk of war. And that's at the end of the round, because it outweighs the magnitude, scope, irreversibility, and prerequisite, we urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Is everybody ready? biggest mistake my opponents just made is ignoring the framework. They don't tell you what economic development is and environmental protection is. They just want you to assume that everything they're talking about is automatically economic development. That's problematic because of what Will talks about in summary. Remember, you're either looking to intent or the primary effects. Either way, as long as you have one of those, that's how you determine whether it's environmental protection or economic development. My opponent's entire advocacy is subsumed with NARS. Now, here's why you're going to affirm. The first is off the independent benefits of prioritizing economic development. We tell you those in our second contention. Off of transportation infrastructure, India really needs this. Farmers see a 50 to 100% increase in per capita income, which is going to save which is going to save lives according to that Princeton analysis that I already gave you, because people have higher incomes. On electricity, remember my opponents tell you that prioritizing renewable energy, which is economic development, according to either intent or effects, is going to reduce tons of air pollution and is going to solve global warming. And if that's the case, that's a huge impact and a huge reason to affirm. But next, if we look at health infrastructure, that saves 765,000 lives every single year, and it's taking it out of the environmental media. The primary effect is to essentially improve the economy. What that means is that that's ultimately off ground. That's a reason to affirm. But the next reason you're going to affirm, and more importantly, is that the affirmative advocacy is a prerequisite to everything my opponents talk about. First, on poverty. The reason that we have the problems my opponents are identifying with overabuse and water shortages is because people are too poor to actually care about anything. Now, my opponents try to tell you that, oh, poverty is going to decrease or increase with all these economic reforms. But that's just not true. Remember the evidence that we provide you in every single one of our contentions that tells you when you prioritize transportation infrastructure, when you prioritize electrification, when you prioritize health and free trade, those empirically lead to reductions in poverty. You can call for the evidence after the round. What that means is that when you vote pro, you ensure that the resources that are being used are going to be used in a more responsible way because people aren't going to deplete them at any cost. My opponents say that the only reason farmers are overplanting, which solves back for both agrarian and water shortages, is because they're growing cash crops. But the reason they care about cash crops in the first place is because they're too poor to grow anything else. They're not looking at the long-term impacts of what they're doing, and that's because of poverty. Until you solve poverty, the affirmative advocacy is the only way to do that. You don't get any of the impacts my opponents are telling you. My opponents give you the weighing analysis for you for why you're going to affirm. Economic development is a prerequisite. You don't get any of the benefits if you negate.